The Last Common Ancestors, Survival in the Miocene World, Section 1. Life on a Fragile Edge. The world, 10 million years ago, looked both familiar and alien. The continents had already drifted into shapes we might recognize on a map today, though their climate and cover told a different story. Africa was greener in some places, drier in others. Europe had vast stretches of woodland, and Asia bore wide belts of grassland that stretched further than the eye could see. And scattered across these landscapes were the ancestors who would one day give rise to us. Not yet human, not yet even fully separated from the branching paths of chimpanzees, gorillas, and other great apes. They were small-bodied, long-armed, dependent on trees for safety, but curious about the ground. Their survival was never guaranteed. Pause for a moment. Imagine lying in that world. The air is warm, thick with the scent of damp vegetation. The rustle in the canopy above could be a fruiting branch swaying, or a leopard on the hunt. Every sound mattered. Every shadow could decide whether life continued or ended. And yet, here we are, millions of years later, able to listen to this story. Which begs the question, why didn't we go extinct then? When you think about extinction, it often feels like a dramatic event. An asteroid striking, a sudden disaster, a world ending in a flash. But for the creatures of the Miocene, extinction was a quieter threat. It came slowly, through dwindling resources, shifting habitats, and subtle climate shifts that favored some and doomed others. 10 million years ago, the Earth was cooling. The lush forests that had once stretched almost endlessly were retreating, replaced by open savannas. For tree-dwelling primates, this was devastating. Their food sources grew scarcer, the distance between safe havens of trees grew wider, and predators gained the advantage in the open ground. Many species failed to adjust. Fossils tell us of entire branches of ape-like creatures that vanished, leaving no descendants. They lived for a time in their small corners of the world, and then were gone. But among them, a few lineages endured. They were not the strongest, not the fiercest, not even the cleverest, at least not yet. They endured because they adapted in small, sometimes boring ways. They learned to eat a wider variety of foods, fruits when they were plenty, leaves when they had to, roots and tough seeds when nothing else was left. They shifted between trees and ground, never entirely at home in either, but never completely dependent on just one. They carried their young longer, ensuring survival rates slightly higher than their rivals. Tiny adjustments, invisible victories. That, over time, spelled the difference between survival and extinction. If you're listening right now, you might notice how quiet these details feel, almost dull compared to grand battles or great empires. But this is the quiet history that actually shaped us. The story of survival isn't usually dramatic. It's the story of not giving up when conditions change. And since you've stayed with me this far, let me gently remind you. If you enjoy these calm, wandering journeys through history, you can always leave a like or share it with someone who also struggles to fall asleep. Think of it as passing down a tool, just as those early ancestors passed down their quiet resilience. Now, picture an early ancestor perched in a Miocene tree. Her hands are curled around the branch, her child clinging to her belly. Below, the tall grasses ripple in the wind. Somewhere, a predator waits. Perhaps a saber-toothed cat, patient and still. The mother waits too. She does not leap recklessly. She does not starve in stubbornness when fruit is gone. She moves slowly to another patch, another chance. This is survival. Not heroic, not glorious, but steady, careful, deliberate. And yet, the question remains. Many other species did not make it. Entire forests disappeared, carrying their inhabitants into extinction. Climate continued to shift, landscapes continued to change. So why, in this fragile balance, did our ancestors, and not another branch of apes, manage to cling to existence? Perhaps it was accident. Perhaps it was small adaptations stacked upon each other. Or perhaps it was something deeper, a particular way of seeing the world, of noticing small changes and adjusting before it was too late. We don't yet have the full answer. Fossils are silent on intention. Stones do not tell us why a mother shifted her child to another tree, or why a group ventured further in search of food. All we know is that somehow they endured, and in that endurance, the faint line that would lead to us continued unbroken. And so we arrive at the edge of a greater mystery. If these small creatures, living in a dangerous and unstable world, managed to avoid extinction, what specific choices, what specific survival patterns made the difference? Section 2. Adaptations and Daily Survival. If you close your eyes for a moment and imagine the world 10 million years ago, it is not the same Earth you know today. The landscapes are shifting, unstable, restless. Where dense forests once dominated, now patches of woodland break apart into grassland. Streams that once ran strong trickle into dryness for long stretches of the year. The climate itself is tilting slowly cooler, drier, and more unpredictable. And here, in this changing world, our ancestors lived their ordinary days. There is a temptation to imagine survival as a single heroic act, a great leap forward, a discovery, or an invention that forever secured life. But in truth, survival in the Miocene was a chain of small decisions, repeated endlessly. It was waking up each day, finding food, keeping watch, nursing young, avoiding danger. The remarkable thing is not how exciting it all was. The remarkable thing is how boring, repetitive, and cautious it had to be, and how those patterns of ordinary survival shaped who we would become. Food, the constant struggle. 10 million years ago, food was never guaranteed. Fruit-bearing trees existed, but their ranges were inconsistent. A small group might discover a patch heavy with figs or wild berries one week, only to find it barren the next. To survive, our ancestors had to broaden their diets. This meant learning to chew tougher foods, not just the sweet fruits of the canopy, but fibrous leaves, bitter stems, hard seeds, and underground roots. Their teeth show this history. Thicker enamel than earlier primates, adapted not for delicacy, but for endurance. Imagine biting into a fruit that is not quite ripe, the sour taste filling the mouth, or gnawing at a fibrous root that offers little joy but enough calories to keep moving. These were not feasts. They were the daily grind of survival. Over time, individuals who could tolerate variety, who did not starve when fruit was scarce, were the ones who left descendants. The specialists, the picky eaters, faded away. And this pattern of survival favoring flexibility is one we still carry. Water, the quiet necessity. Food is one struggle. Water is another. Streams and rivers in the Miocene often ran shallow. Dry seasons could stretch longer than expected. For tree-dwelling primates, this meant journeys down from the canopy, across exposed ground, to drink. And this was dangerous. The ground was the domain of predators. Big cats, ancestors of leopards and lions, crouched in the tall grass. Massive snakes lay still, waiting. Even crocodiles lingered in the muddy banks. To drink, then, was not casual. It was an act of tension. Imagine a group approaching a stream, some keeping watch, others quickly lowering their faces to the water. The risk was real. Many did not return, but still they had to drink. And so they developed habits, drinking at safer times, moving in small coordinated groups, avoiding waterholes where predators gathered. It was not genius, it was not bravery, it was routine, the slow shaping of survival through caution. Predators. Living in fear. It is easy to underestimate how surrounded our ancestors were by danger. The Miocene world was full of hunters, not only big cats but also giant birds with sharp beaks, snakes longer than a man is tall, and packs of wild dogs that could run for miles. For a small-bodied primate, everything was a threat. Survival required vigilance. Even sleep was not safe. Night came with sounds, rustling, calls, footsteps in the dark. One adaptation, though subtle, became crucial: the reliance on social groups. Those who lived together, moved together, and kept watch together had higher chances of survival than loners. An individual might miss the flicker of movement in the grass, but a group, dozens of eyes scanning in silence, was less likely to be surprised. And so, slowly, group living became the norm. Safety in numbers. Not safety absolute, but safety enough. This habit did not just protect bodies. It shaped minds. Living in groups required communication, not yet speech, but gestures, calls, glances. A raised arm, a sudden sound, a posture of warning. These were the early beginnings of cooperation, which in time would become the core of human society. Movement between trees and ground. Perhaps the most defining adaptation of this era was mobility. Some ancestors clung to the trees. Others ventured more often to the ground. Neither choice was perfect. Trees gave safety, but they were shrinking. Ground gave access to new foods, but it exposed one to predators. And so, the survivors were those who could do both, climbing well, yet walking when needed, gripping branches with curled toes, yet stepping on earth with cautious strides. It is here that we begin to glimpse the faint beginnings of bipedalism. Not fully human walking, not yet, but small advantages: freeing the hands to carry food, standing briefly to scan the horizon, reaching into the tall grass. These were not revolutions. They were small habits, repeated, passed down, and in these ordinary habits lay the seeds of something much larger. Reproduction and care. Survival was not only about individuals, it was about children. An adult who survived but left no offspring was a dead end in the chain of history. For our ancestors, reproduction was fragile. Infant mortality was high. Food shortages, disease, predators, all claimed the young at alarming rates. Those who cared longer, carried their young further, protected them more attentively, saw more of their children survive. This extended care, though costly in time and energy, gradually became a winning strategy. Again, it was not dramatic. It was not a sudden transformation. But over thousands of years, the tendency to nurture more deeply, to guard more carefully, was passed on, and with it, the slow shaping of a species that values its young with unusual intensity. Boring victories, lasting consequences. When you look at the fossil record, much of what we know comes from bones and teeth. Teeth especially. Thick enamel, wearing patterns, fractures. They tell the story of diets and struggles, of tough food eaten in lean times. But behind those remains are the ordinary details. A female carrying her child an extra day before setting it down. A group waiting until dusk to drink, rather than noon when predators gathered. An individual daring to step into grassland to dig for roots, while others starved in the trees. Tiny choices. Invisible to the grand scale of history. But without them, the line leading to us might have ended in silence. If you are still awake, listening to this slow march of boring survival, take a moment to notice something. You, right now, are the result of countless such ordinary victories. Every ancestor who adjusted, who endured a little longer, who made one more cautious choice, led to you being here. And if this kind of calm wandering through the forgotten corners of history helps you drift into sleep, you might consider sharing it, like passing a fruit branch from one hand to another. It helps keep the chain alive, and yet, we still have not answered the deeper question. So many species lived in the Miocene. So many apes, primates, and other mammals shared those landscapes. Most are gone. Their bones rest in the earth, with no descendants to carry their story. Why did our line survive while theirs did not? Was it mere luck? Was it the ability to adapt? Was it group living, or diet, or mobility? Or was it something quieter, something we cannot yet see in the fossil record? A way of noticing patterns, a spark of awareness, a curiosity about the world. This is the puzzle we must face as we move into the next part of the story. And so we leave this section with an open thought. If survival is not about being the strongest, or the fiercest, or the cleverest, but about being the most adaptable, then perhaps the question is not why we survived, but what exactly we adapted to, and how much we owe to chance. Section 3. What endured and what vanished. When we look back at the Miocene, that long, restless epoch stretching from 23 to 5 million years ago, it is tempting to treat it as a blur of distant prehistory, a stage set too far away to matter. Yet it was here, in this seemingly forgotten chapter, that the story of our survival was truly written. By the closing millions of years of the Miocene, much had already been decided. Entire ape species, once diverse and spread across Africa, Europe, and Asia, had vanished. They had lived for hundreds of thousands of years, adapting to their corners of the world. And yet, when forests withdrew and climates cooled, they could not adjust quickly enough. Their lineages ended. Others, however, lingered. Among them, the ancestors who would one day become us. The narrow escape. It is important to remember how slim the margin of survival really was. The fossil record shows us decline. Great apes that once numbered in dozens of species dwindled. By the end of the Miocene, only a handful remained. The early ancestors of gorillas, chimpanzees, and humans among them. Survival was not a guarantee. It was, in many ways, an accident. A line could vanish in the space of a drought, a fire, a disease. One unlucky season might erase an entire community. And yet, somehow, enough endured. Enough children lived long enough to grow. Enough mothers carried them safely. Enough groups found food when times were harsh. The margin was razor thin. Without a few thousand small victories, the branch that led to us would have snapped. When you think of it that way, our very existence is a fragile inheritance, held together by chance as much as by strength. The cost of survival. But survival came with costs. Adapting to tougher diets reshaped teeth and jaws, trading delicacy for durability. Living in groups demanded constant vigilance, conflict, and compromise. Shifting between trees and ground meant never being fully at home in either. These costs were not glamorous. They were daily burdens, aching muscles, worn teeth, frayed nerves, yet each compromise bought another generation. And in that slow grind, resilience took root. Resilience not as a heroic burst of courage, but as a patient endurance of discomfort. This is perhaps the most human of inheritances. Even today, much of our survival depends not on brilliance or dominance, but on persistence, the willingness to bear hardship until conditions change. Seeds of the future. By the final stretch of the Miocene, a few faint outlines of our future had already appeared. Social living had become essential. Groups were no longer optional. They were survival itself. Dietary flexibility had been carved into bone and enamel, teaching our ancestors to see food where others saw only famine. Mobility, climbing and cautious walking, hinted at the eventual stride of humanity. Extended care for young set us apart from other mammals, embedding patience and nurturing as part of survival. None of these looked remarkable at the time. They were not breakthroughs. They were habits, patterns, routines, but in the long arc of history, they were foundations. Without them, there would be no later discoveries, no fire, no tools, no culture. Survival itself came first. What vanished? For every adaptation that endured, countless others vanished. Species that were too specialized, bound to a single type of forest or a narrow diet, disappeared with their habitats. Creatures that failed to live in groups or that bred too slowly left no descendants. Lines that could not cross the widening gaps between trees ended in silence. If you imagine the Miocene as a vast branching tree of life, most of those branches snapped off. Only a few narrow twigs survived, one of which improbably carried forward to you and me. The silence of those vanished branches should remind us, survival is not guaranteed. It is a rare, fragile outcome dependent on balance, chance, and change. Reflection. Why we survived. And so we return to the question that began this story. Why didn't we go extinct 10 million years ago? The answer is not dramatic. It is not a single reason. It is a web of small ones. Because our ancestors ate what they could, even when it was bitter. Because they traveled in groups, even when it meant conflict. Because they carried their children longer, even when it was exhausting. Because they adapted. Not quickly, not easily, but steadily enough to endure. And perhaps, too, because of chance. For all our patterns and adaptations, survival often depends on events beyond control. A flood missed, a predator avoided, a disease endured. We survived not because we were destined to, but because enough tiny accidents lined up in our favor. A gentle closing thought. If you are still awake, let this thought settle. Every ordinary day you live is stacked upon millions of such ordinary days in the past. Each one carried forward survival until it reached you. It is not the dramatic stories that built the line of humanity. It is the boring ones. The steady chewing of roots, the cautious trips to water, the endless patience of carrying the young. And so, when you drift into sleep tonight, you might carry with you the awareness that survival itself is not loud. It is quiet, it is careful, and it is fragile. The Miocene has ended. The forests have changed. The world has shifted. But the thread of life, thin and trembling, endured. Which brings us to the next chapter in this long history of not going extinct. If our ancestors survived the Miocene, what new challenges awaited them as the climate grew colder, as the first sparks of culture and fire began to appear? That is the story we will step into next. Story 2. Fire and Hunger, the first sparks of human survival. Section 1. The long nights before fire. Before fire, there was darkness. Not the soft, familiar darkness of a modern night, lit faintly by lamps, glowing screens, or the distant hum of a city, but a true, consuming darkness, a world where once the sun dipped below the horizon, sight gave way to sound, and sound gave way to fear. For our early ancestors, perhaps 2 million years ago, life without fire meant living by the rhythms of the day. Sunlight guided the search for food, water, and shelter. Nightfall brought vulnerability. A body without fur to insulate, without claws to defend, and without fangs to strike, had little choice but to retreat. Imagine a small group huddled together under the branches of a tree or in the mouth of a shallow cave. The night is alive with noises. The distant roar of a lion, the crack of a branch beneath a stalking leopard, the restless calls of birds and insects stirred by moonlight. For these early humans, the night was not a time for activity. It was a time to wait, to endure, to survive. And through these endless nights, hunger lingered. Hunger, as a constant companion food, was never guaranteed. Meat, when scavenged from the remains of a predator's kill, came rarely. Fruits and roots filled stomachs, but poorly. Raw meat, when obtained, was tough and dangerous, filled with parasites difficult to chew and quick to rot. Hunger was not an occasional problem. It was the background of life. Archaeological traces show bones gnawed by stone tools, evidence of marrow sucked from within. These details are not glamorous. They are signs of desperation, of groups breaking long bones to scrape the last scraps of nutrition. And yet, hunger was also a teacher. It pushed our ancestors to experiment, to try new foods, to wander further, to take risks that others avoided. Hunger set the stage for fire, because fire would become not only warmth and light, but the difference between gnawing raw sinew and eating cooked flesh. The first encounters with fire. But in these earliest days, fire was not yet a tool. It was a mystery. Natural fires raged across savannas after lightning strikes. Flames spread quickly, crackling through dry grass, devouring trees, leaving smoke curling into the sky. To our ancestors, fire must have been terrifying, a force too large to control, too dangerous to approach. And yet, from a distance, it offered something new. After a fire, the ground was blackened, but fresh shoots soon appeared, drawing grazing animals. Burnt remains of carcasses may have left meat softer, easier to chew. The smell of roasted food would have carried in the air. Perhaps the first spark of curiosity came here. Watching, from the safety of trees or caves as flames consumed the land, leaving both destruction and opportunity. At first, humans did not make fire. They gathered from it. A still-burning branch, a smoldering log carried cautiously back to camp. The fire might last a night, maybe two, before going out. Keeping it alive was harder than finding it. And so, before mastery, there was trial, fumbling, failing, watching fire die again and again. But even that small borrowed flame changed everything. What fire meant. Imagine that first night when fire burned at the center of a small group. The flames cast light, pushing back the darkness. Shadows flickered on cave walls. Predators, once bold in the night, kept their distance from the strange glow. For the first time, the group could sit awake into the night. Not in silence, not in fear, but in something like safety. And beyond safety, fire meant food. Meat roasted over flame softened, its fibers breaking down. Tubers and roots, once bitter, became edible. Dangerous bacteria burned away. Stomachs filled more easily. Bodies grew stronger. The human body itself would change because of fire. Cooking released energy more efficiently, shrinking our ancestors' jaws and teeth, even reshaping digestive tracts. The gains of fire were not immediate, but they were profound. Over generations, they altered what it meant to be human. But in this early stage, fire was still fragile. A flame not tended would vanish. Rain could extinguish it. A careless step could scatter embers into the dirt. Fire was a gift, but a temporary one. Nights of light, days of hunger. In these earliest encounters, fire and hunger coexisted. By day, groups still scavenged, still cracked bones for marrow, still searched wide territories for berries, roots, and small animals. By night, they gathered around their hard-won flames, watching sparks drift into the dark sky. It must have felt like a miracle. Warmth against the chill, light against the void, safety against predators. But it was not yet enough. Fire did not solve hunger overnight. It did not erase danger. It did not guarantee survival. It was only the beginning of a new pattern, a hint of a future where humans would not merely endure nature, but bend it. A pause for reflection. If you're listening closely now, you might notice how small and fragile these beginnings feel. The story of fire is not an instant triumph. It is a long, boring struggle of trial and error, of carrying embers, tending logs, gathering fuel. And yet, it is in these small beginnings that the future turned. Every warm meal you have, every light you switch on, every safe night's sleep you know, stretches back to those first groups sitting around uncertain flames. And since you've followed this far into history's quiet, let me softly remind you. If you find comfort in these gentle wanderings, you might pass it along. A like, a share, a comment. In its own way, that too is fire being carried forward. Unanswered questions. And so we end this first section with questions that cannot fully be answered. When did fire truly become part of human life? Who was the first to carry an ember, to protect it through the night, to feed it carefully with dry grass and twigs. How many times was fire lost, forgotten, and rediscovered before it finally stayed? The bones and stones of archaeology give us glimpses, but not answers. What we know is that the story of fire is not a single invention. It is a long patience, a long persistence, stretching across generations. And that is where we leave this part of the story. Before fire became mastery, it was mystery. Before it became a tool, it was a fragile companion. Hunger remained, danger remained, but a new light had been born in the dark. The question that remains is this: when did fire shift from a borrowed miracle to a human inheritance? That is where we will go in the next section. Section 2. Mastery and Meals. How Fire Changed the Body and the Mind Picture. A campfire burning in the dark of prehistory. It is not large, just a cluster of glowing embers, flickering flames feeding on dry wood. Around it sit figures with long arms, heavy brows, and sharp eyes that glow faintly in the firelight. They are not yet us, but close enough that if you saw them, you might feel an uneasy recognition. This scene, repeated again and again for tens of thousands of nights, marked a turning point. Fire was no longer something only feared or borrowed. It was something guarded, tended, passed from hand to hand, night to night. And with that mastery came change, slow, subtle, but irreversible. Cooking and the human body. The first and most obvious transformation was food itself. Raw meat is difficult to chew, heavy to digest, and dangerous to consume. Roots are fibrous and bitter, often filled with toxins that make the stomach churn. Fire changed all of this. Meat roasted softened, breaking down its fibers, releasing more calories in less time. Roots became sweeter, safer, and more nourishing once baked in the embers. Even grains, hard and unyielding when raw, became edible when heated. Cooking meant more energy for less effort. And energy, in the economy of survival, is everything. Over generations, this advantage reshaped the body. Teeth and jaws shrank, no longer needed for endless chewing of raw plants. Guts shortened, as easier-to-digest food required less processing. Brains grew larger, fueled by the extra calories unlocked by cooking. Every meal eaten by firelight was not just a relief from hunger, it was an investment in the body and mind of the species. Fire as protection beyond food, fire meant safety. Predators that once prowled fearlessly at night now kept their distance. The glow, the heat, the strange crackling sounds all pushed lions, leopards, and hyenas back into the dark. For early humans, this was revolutionary. Nights no longer belonged solely to fear. A circle of fire meant a circle of safety, fragile but real. It allowed groups to rest more deeply, to gather in larger numbers, to sleep in places that were once too dangerous. This, in turn, changed social life. With predators held at bay, the night became a time not just for hiding, but for staying awake together. Fire and social bonds. Here, perhaps more than anywhere, fire shaped the mind. Think of what happens when a group gathers around a fire. The light pulls people close. The warmth invites them to sit longer. With stomachs fuller from cooked meals and the night safer from predators, there was time. Time to gesture, to share sounds, to tell the first fragments of story. Fire stretched the day into the night. It turned survival into something communal. It created a space where communication deepened, where cooperation grew stronger, where young ones listened and learned. Anthropologists often say that language, culture, and memory were born by the fire. Perhaps not suddenly, but slowly, in the repeated rhythm of nightly gatherings. Imagine an elder pointing toward the horizon, miming the hunt that failed that day. Others watch, learning, remembering, or a parent passing roasted tuber to a child, signaling with sound and gesture that this was safe, this was good. The fire was not just a tool. It was a teacher. The mind's quiet expansion. With fire came not only better meals, but longer thoughts. In the dark, before fire, the mind had little space for reflection. Fear ruled, and silence pressed heavy. But with fire, there was light. Shadows danced, faces could be seen. Flames could be tended, poked, studied. The simple act of keeping a fire alive required planning, collecting fuel, remembering where dry wood could be found, working together to carry embers when moving camps. Each of these acts trained memory, foresight, and patience. Cooking itself demanded attention. Food too near the flames burned. Food too far remained raw. Watching, adjusting, learning. These were the small experiments of survival. Over time, they were also the small experiments of thought. The fire was a puzzle, and solving it again and again nurtured the beginnings of the human mind. The emotional weight of fire. But fire was not only practical, it was emotional. For the first time, warmth in cold nights was not only from bodies huddled together, but from something external, controllable. Comfort was not just a fleeting accident. It could be sustained. The fire also gave rhythm. Flames flared, dimmed, sparked. Embers glowed like stars fallen to earth. To watch a fire was to be mesmerized. And even today, the sight of flickering flames pulls the mind into a kind of trance. Perhaps this was true for our ancestors as well. And in that trance, reflection deepened. Not just survival, but meaning began to take root. Evidence in stone and bone. Archaeologists have found traces of ancient hearths, blackened soil, clusters of charred bone, fragments of stone tools cracked by heat. These are not just signs of survival. They are signs of permanence. A hearth is not an accident. It is a place returned to again and again. It is the beginning of home. The bones, often bearing marks of cutting and burning, tell us of meals shared, of marrow extracted, of food transformed by flame. The stones tell us of tools hardened in fire, sharpened and strengthened. Piece by piece, these traces confirm what the body already shows. Fire was not a passing curiosity. It was a turning point. The boring, endless work. And yet, mastery was not glamorous. Fire demanded constant work. Wood had to be gathered daily, sometimes carried long distances. Fires had to be tended at night, embers fed, smoke endured. Rain could undo days of effort. A careless wind could scatter sparks into nothing. There was no single discovery that made fire easy. It was the endless patience of ordinary people, repeating the same work, night after night, year after year. This is the rhythm of survival. Not leaps, but persistence. Reflection. If you are still awake, listening to this long history of fire, notice how much of it feels familiar. Even now, we gather around warm light, not always flames, but the glow of lamps, screens, or hearths. We still sit together. We still share stories in the circle of light. In that sense, nothing has changed. The fire of the past is alive in every small comfort of the present. And since you're part of this quiet journey, I'll gently remind you, if these stories ease your night, you can carry them forward, the way fire was once carried ember to ember, a like, a share, a word passed on, small flames in the dark. The next question. But we are left with a deeper question. If fire gave us food, protection, warmth, and time, how far did it reach into our minds? Did fire only shape the body and habits, or did it also ignite imagination, memory, and the first flickers of culture? That is the mystery we turn to next. Section 3. The Flames of Culture. Fire as the first human inheritance. Imagine an ancient plain, silent under a vast star-filled sky. A small fire burns in the center of a clearing. Around it, a circle of faces glows, some young, some old. Shadows stretch outwards, dancing like spirits across the grass. The people gathered here have eaten, warmed themselves, and pushed the darkness back. But now, something else happens. They do not scatter immediately to sleep. They linger. They stay in the glow. It is here, in this circle of light, that culture begins. The fire as memory. The flames became more than warmth or safety. They became a thread of memory. Every fire carried a story of the journey to find it, of the hunt that fed it, of the hands that kept it alive through storm and night. Children watched as embers were nursed into flame, and in that patient act they saw more than survival. They saw continuity, a chain that reached backward into the past and forward into the future. When we say humans inherited fire, it was not through genes, but through teaching. One generation showed the next how to gather wood, how to shield flame from wind, how to coax sparks into life. Fire was not only a tool, it was a lesson. Fire as gathering place. For nomads, the land shifted constantly. Rivers rose and fell. Herds moved on. Shelters crumbled. But the hearth, no matter how temporary, became the true center. It was where the group returned after the day's labor. It was where decisions were made. It was where songs, chants, or rhythms might first have echoed into the night. The circle of fire was the first architecture of community. A home was not defined by walls, but by the glow of flame and the people around it. The birth of storytelling. It is almost impossible to imagine early human life without stories. And it is almost impossible to imagine stories without fire. The flames themselves invited imagination. Shadows danced, shapes flickered, sparks rose like tiny stars. To a mind still exploring the world, these sights begged for meaning. Was the fire alive? Were the sparks spirits? Did the shadows tell of hidden beings in the dark? Sitting together in firelight, early humans shared not just food, but words. Or at first, sounds, gestures, rhythms, tales of the hunt, warnings of danger, memories of ancestors. Slowly, over countless nights, these became stories. And with stories came identity. The fire was the stage upon which the drama of culture unfolded. Ritual and sacred flame. As humans grew more skilled, fire took on a sacred quality. It was dangerous, yes, capable of burning flesh, of consuming shelters, of destroying forests. But it was also life-giving. That dual nature demanded respect. Some of the earliest rituals likely formed around fire. Flames may have been kept burning through the night as protection against spirits. Ashes may have been scattered as offerings to unseen powers. Special fires may have marked births, deaths, or hunts. We see echoes of this in cultures across the world. From eternal flames tended in ancient temples, to the sacred hearths of households, to the candles lit in modern rituals. The idea that fire must be honored has never left us. In this way, fire was the first bridge between the practical and the spiritual. Fire as technology. But the inheritance of fire was not only symbolic, it was also technological. With fire, wood could be hardened into stronger spears. Stone tools could be heated and reshaped. Later, clay could be fired into pottery, transforming fragile earth into lasting vessels. Each step opened new possibilities. Each new possibility reinforced the role of fire as essential, irreplaceable. And because fire was dangerous, mastery of it became a mark of skill. Those who could tend it, protect it, and use it wisely were respected. In this sense, fire shaped not only tools, but hierarchies, traditions, and roles within the group. Fire and the first sense of home. There is something deeply human about the hearth. Even today, when we see a fireplace, a campfire, or even the soft glow of a candle, we feel something more than simple warmth. We feel a pull toward safety, toward belonging. This is inheritance. The comfort of fire is written into us by thousands of generations who gathered around it. For them, the fire was the marker of home. Not the cave, not the hut, not the camp, but the flame at the center. Without it, even stone walls felt exposed. With it, even the open plain felt like shelter. The long vigil. But culture is not only born of warmth and comfort, it is also born of vigilance. Fire had to be watched, embers had to be stirred, wood had to be fed into the flames. This was work that often lasted deep into the night. Perhaps this was where music began. Rhythms tapped out to stay awake. Perhaps it was where the first lullabies were sung to restless children as parents kept watch. Perhaps it was where myths of night spirits and guardians were woven. The act of tending fire was itself a cultural seed, teaching responsibility, patience, and shared duty. The symbol of light fire also gave humanity its first true symbol of hope. In darkness, light is meaning. To hold a flame against the night was to declare that life could endure, that chaos could be pushed back. Fire was, in every sense, the first beacon. It is no surprise that across history, fire became a metaphor for knowledge, for love, for the soul itself. The inheritance of fire was not only practical skill, but a symbolic language that endures to this day. The legacy across time. Archaeological evidence shows that hearths were tended not for days or months, but for centuries. Some sites reveal layers of ash built up over generations, as one fire was rekindled again and again in the same spot. This was not accidental. It was tradition. A place where the living gathered as the dead once had, a reminder that to keep the flame alive was to keep the past alive as well. And so fire became the first true inheritance. Not carried in the blood, but carried in ritual. Not hidden in the earth, but carried ember to ember, from parent to child, from village to village, from age to age. Reflection. As you drift deeper into the quiet of this story, consider this. Every flame we light today, in a lamp, a stove, a candle, is a whisper from that inheritance. The fire that burns in your home is not new. It is a continuation of a chain, stretching back to the first humans who dared to tame the wild spark. When you sit in the glow of a light at night, you are repeating a ritual as old as humanity itself, gathering in the circle of safety, watching shadows dance and feeling, for a moment, that you belong to something enduring. Closing fire gave us food, safety, and warmth. But more than that, it gave us story, ritual, imagination, and memory. It was the first inheritance we carried not in our bodies, but in our culture. And as we move forward in this series, we will see again and again how human survival has never been just about the body. It has always been about the mind, the spirit, and the fragile but powerful things we pass on to one another. The fire is not only in the past, it is in us still. Story 3. Walls of Mud and Stone, the First Villages section. 1. The tentative step away from wandering. Imagine the world 10,000 years ago. The ice was retreating, the great mammoths and woolly beasts fading into memory. The earth was warming, rivers swelling, grasslands spreading wide where glaciers once ruled. For countless generations, people had followed the herds, wandering in cycles of hunt and harvest. They knew the land not as property, but as a rhythm, a path walked and re-walked, where camps rose and vanished like footprints in the sand. But slowly, quietly, a shift began. Some groups lingered. They stayed a little longer by the rivers where wild grain grew thick. They noticed how seeds fell and sprouted again, how plants returned in the same places, season after season. They discovered that by scattering seeds and waiting, the land could be persuaded to give back. And with that discovery, the old rhythm began to change. The first seeds of settlement. It did not happen overnight. The hunters still hunted. The gatherers still wandered. but year by year a few camps grew heavier with objects not easily carried. Clay vessels, grinding stones, woven mats. People stayed longer, and so they built more. At first, shelters were simple. Huts of branches, hides, or reeds. But in certain places, mud was pressed into bricks and stone was stacked into walls. Small, fragile structures, yet different from the temporary shelters before. They were not meant for a single night or a single season. They were meant to last. This was a new idea. Permanence. The village emerges. One hut became two. Two became many, and in time the first villages were born. These were not cities as we know them. No towering walls, no marketplaces, no temples yet. But they were more than camps. They were places with memory, places where generations returned to the same hearths. In some valleys, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of such villages. Neat circles of mud brick houses, floors plastered smooth, walls painted with ochre and lime. Buried beneath the floors, the bones of ancestors rested, as though the houses themselves had souls. To live in such a place was to feel something new, that the land and the walls upon it belonged to you, and that you belonged to them. The weight of belonging. But belonging brought burdens. A village could not simply be abandoned at the first sign of hunger. Fields had to be tended, walls repaired, granaries guarded. People were tied now, not only to each other, but to the soil beneath their feet. The freedom of wandering faded into the responsibility of staying. The world grew smaller, and yet, in another way, it grew larger. For with villages came neighbors. Families no longer drifted as isolated groups. They clustered. They shared water, tools, and work. They argued, too, over boundaries, over food, over who should lead. Human life grew denser, more complex. The walls of protection. Why walls? At first, perhaps, to keep out the wind, the rain, the creeping cold of night. A roof and a wall meant shelter, comfort, safety. But as villages grew, walls meant something more. They marked boundaries. They said, inside is ours, outside is theirs. Inside is family, outside is stranger. Even the humblest mud brick wall carried meaning. It turned open land into enclosed space. It turned earth into home. And in time, whole villages ringed themselves with walls, not just for weather, but for defense. Though in these early days the threats were not yet armies, but hunger, animals, and rival clans. The first walls were not fortresses but promises. Promises of protection, promises of belonging. Fire within the walls. Inside each home, fire still burned. The inheritance of flame continued, but now it was steadied by permanence. Hearths were fixed, built into the floors. Soot stained the ceilings. Smoke curled upward through small holes. Here, meals were cooked, tools hardened, clay baked. Around these hearths, families sat together night after night. The fire that had once been shared beneath open skies now flickered behind walls, more private, more intimate. This, too, was a change. The fire was no longer only a communal gathering point. It became a family hearth, a symbol of one household among many. And yet, at the heart of the village, sometimes a larger fire burned, a public flame where people still gathered, where old rhythms of story and song survived. New rhythms of life. With villages came routine, planting in spring, harvest in summer and autumn, storage in winter. Time itself began to be measured differently, not by the endless wandering of the herds, but by the cycles of crops and the tasks of settled life. Children were born into houses rather than tents. They grew up knowing walls, knowing the same paths and corners. The land was no longer just a stage of movement, but a place of roots. The first conflicts of staying. But permanence had its shadows. Where once scarcity drove people onward, now scarcity struck at home. If crops failed, if storage spoiled, hunger came with no easy escape. The walls that sheltered could also imprison, and so villages sometimes fell into conflict, over water, over fertile fields, over grazing land. The first walls of mud and stone, so humble in appearance, carried within them the seeds of future wars. Yet they also carried seeds of cooperation. To build a wall, people had to work together. To share harvests, they had to trust. To live so close, they had to learn patience, compromise, and rules. The emotional weight. Imagine the feelings of those first settlers. For generations, their ancestors had roamed open spaces, following the wind and the stars. Now they found themselves inside walls. To some, perhaps, it felt comforting, a relief to sleep without fear of rain or beasts. To others, perhaps, it felt confining, a cage against the wide freedom of the plains. In that tension lay the birth of human society, the pull between freedom and stability, between wandering and belonging, a balance we still wrestle with today. The archaeological echo. Even now, when archaeologists uncover the remains of these early villages, collapsed walls, fire pits, worn, grinding stones, they find more than ruins. They find evidence of the human choice to stay, to build, to root. Each mud brick pressed by hand, each stone laid carefully in place, whispers of a decision. Here we will remain. Here we will make a home. Section 2. The village as a living organism. Work, ritual, and community. A village is more than huts and walls. It breathes. It pulses with life. From the moment the first rays of sun touched the earth, the rhythm of the village began. Dogs barked, fires were stirred, voices carried across courtyards. Life within the walls had a pattern, as though the village itself was alive. Its houses the bones, its paths the veins, its people the heart. The daily work. To live in a village was to live in constant work. The land demanded attention, and so did the animals, the tools, the homes. At dawn, men and women stepped out of their doorways to tend to the fields. Some bent low to scatter seeds. Others guided stone plows, pulled by oxen, or in earlier times by human shoulders alone. Children followed, carrying water jars or chasing away birds that pecked at the grain. Not all labored in the fields. Within the village, other tasks filled the day. Women ground grain on heavy stones, rocking back and forth until flour lay in fine, pale heaps. Potters shaped clay into jars and bowls, hands wet, thumbs steady, leaving the faint marks of fingers still visible to us thousands of years later. Weavers worked reeds, wool, or flax into mats and cloth. Carvers chipped flint or obsidian into blades sharp enough to cut hide, wood, or bone. Each task fed another, and each depended on the rest. A broken jar meant no water. A dull blade meant no harvest. The village lived through this web of labor, each thread woven tight by human hands. Shared effort. Unlike the wandering bands of old, where families might part ways after a season, villagers were bound to one another. When it was time to plant, neighbors worked side by side. When a roof needed repair, hands from many houses lifted the beams together. When herds returned at dusk, children called them home across the shared paths. The village was no longer just a cluster of households. It was an organism, its survival resting on shared effort. One family's misfortune touched all. A failed harvest, a broken tool, an illness. These rippled outward through the community. To live within walls was to be tied to the fate of many. Ritual and rhythm. Work was not the only thread binding the village. Rituals, too, stitched people together. Some rituals were practical, ceremonies to bless the crops, offerings to ask the river for gentle floods, dances to call for rain. Others were born from memory, passed down from wandering days, stories told around the fire, songs sung to the beat of hand drums. In certain villages, the dead were buried beneath the floors of houses. Imagine lying to sleep each night above the bones of grandparents, uncles, or children who had gone before. The house was not just shelter. It was sacred, a place where the living and the dead shared the same roof. Other villages gathered in central courtyards for feasts, where roasted meat was divided, where wine or fermented grain was shared in clay cups. The act of eating together was itself a ritual, turning food into fellowship. And at times, figures were carved in stone or molded in clay. Small statues of animals, of women, of gods not yet named. These were placed in homes or shrines, symbols of hopes that stretched beyond the walls of the village. Festivals of survival. Though life was hard, there were moments of joy. After the harvest, when grain filled the jars and the animals grew fat, festivals broke the rhythm of toil. The people danced, they sang. They painted their bodies with ochre and charcoal, wore feathers in their hair, and drummed until the air itself seemed to throb. In these moments, the village came alive in celebration. Work gave way to laughter, and for a short while, hunger and hardship were forgotten. Such gatherings were more than merriment. They reinforced the sense of belonging. To sing together, to move together, to share food and drink. These were reminders that life was endured not alone, but as one. Conflict and resolution. But where people lived close, conflicts also rose. A boundary disputed, a jar broken, an animal lost. Such things could spark anger. Yet the village could not afford division, and so leaders emerged, not kings or chiefs at first, but respected elders, skilled hunters, wise women who knew the cycles of land and sky. Disputes were settled not only by power, but by ritual. A feast offered, a gift exchanged, a reconciliation sealed by shared drink. The village could not survive if every quarrel splintered it. Rituals of peace were as essential as rituals of harvest. Children of the village. In a settled community, children grew differently than those born into wandering bands. They knew the same paths day after day, the same walls, the same faces. From their first steps, they were part of the organism of the village. They carried water in small jars, watched the animals, learned to grind grain beside their mothers or carve wood beside their fathers. Childhood was short, but full of learning. They also absorbed the rituals of their people. They heard the stories told around the fire, watched the dances, touched the statues, and learned which places in the village were sacred. And, as they grew, they inherited not only tools and land, but the memory of belonging to a place. The invisible web. The village, then, was not just walls of mud and stone. It was an invisible web of ties. Work, which fed the body. Ritual, which fed the spirit. Community, which bound them all together. Each part supported the others. Remove one, and the whole was weakened. Without work, there was no survival. Without ritual, no meaning. Without community, no peace. It was fragile, yes. Floods, famine, or raiders could still shatter it, but within its walls, humanity had discovered something powerful, the strength of many, moving as one. Section 3. From Hearth to Horizon. The legacy of the first villages. The village was never meant to last forever, and yet its legacy stretches farther than its walls, farther even than its fields. The first villages were fragile, humble places. Mud walls crumbling under storms, roofs of reed and thatch bending under the wind, fields vulnerable to flood or drought. Yet from these fragile beginnings grew something greater than stone or earth. From these hearths, humanity carried forward a legacy that still shapes us today. From shelter to society. At first glance, a village was simply shelter, a cluster of homes, a place to rest after toil. But when many homes stood side by side, something else was born. Society. Here, people lived not as scattered bands but as neighbors. They saw one another every day. They shared labor, food, joys, and grief. That closeness gave rise to something profound. Rules, customs, traditions. The first whispers of law. No longer could each family act alone. Each choice rippled outward into the lives of many. The village, then, was not only walls of mud and stone, it was the seedbed of society itself. The invention of belonging. Before villages, a person belonged to a family, a clan, a wandering band. But with settled life came a new form of belonging. To a place. The hearth in one's home, the fields sown each season, the paths worn smooth by familiar feet. These became anchors. The land itself held memory. Graves beneath the floors, shrines in the courtyards, carvings on the walls. Each reminded people that this was not just where they lived, but where they belonged. This sense of rootedness reshaped the human spirit. A wandering hunter might call the forest his home, but a villager could point to a doorway, a path, a wall, and say, "This is mine." Growth and transformation. The legacy of the first villages was not stillness. It was growth. A village might begin with a handful of families, but soon it grew. More houses clustered near the center. More fields stretched outward toward the horizon. More people, more tools, more animals. The village breathed, expanded, and changed. Some became towns, with hundreds of inhabitants. Some built shrines or temples, places where ritual rose from private hearths to public gathering. Some became trade centers, exchanging pottery for stone, grain for metal. Not every village endured, but each one carried forward the experiment of living together. With every expansion, humanity stepped closer to cities, kingdoms, and civilizations. Memory in clay and stone. The legacy of these villages lives not only in our minds, but in the earth itself. Archaeologists have uncovered their traces. Mud brick walls, preserved by accident of time, their impressions still bearing the marks of hands. Pottery shards, fragments of bowls that once held grain or soup, painted with simple lines or geometric designs. Figurines, small statues of animals, women, or deities, left in shrines or buried in homes. Graves beneath floors, skeletons curled as though still sleeping, surrounded by beads, tools, or tokens of love. These remnants speak to us across thousands of years. They tell us not only how people lived, but what they valued: shelter, food, companionship, memory, belief. Every fragment of clay, every wall of stone, whispers the story of humanity learning to live together. The horizon of imagination. What made the village extraordinary was not only what it was, but what it made possible. A campfire could hold a story. A clan could carry a memory. But only a village could nurture imagination that reached beyond a single lifetime. For the first time, children grew up in homes their parents had built, and then built new homes beside them. Knowledge deepened, skills multiplied, traditions lengthened. Over generations, this continuity gave rise to culture. Songs became rituals. Tools became crafts. Stories became myths. And myths gave birth to gods, temples, and nations. The horizon of human imagination stretched farther than the fields, farther than the walls. It stretched toward the future. Fragility and strength. Of course, not all villages survived. Some were abandoned after floods. Others burned. Some fell to raiders or withered when fields could no longer yield. But failure did not erase their significance. Each attempt at village life, each settlement built and lost was a step in learning. Like fragile seedlings, some withered, but others endured long enough to take root. And from those that endured came strength. The strength of permanence, of memory, of shared human effort. The first inheritance. We often think of inheritance as land or wealth. But the first inheritance of humanity was simpler and far more lasting: the village itself. Every village was a gift passed from one generation to the next. Not only the huts or the tools, but the patterns of living. Work shared. food stored, ritual kept, peace sought. Even when one village ended, the knowledge carried forward to the next. A better wall built, a stronger roof woven, a more reliable store of grain. The inheritance was not property alone, it was wisdom. The quiet miracle. When we think of human progress, we imagine inventions, the wheel, writing, metal, engines, but perhaps the quietest miracle was the village itself. It needed no genius, no sudden spark. It grew slowly, like a tree, from the soil of necessity. Yet without it, none of the rest could have followed. The village was the root system from which civilization grew. Without its experiments in cooperation, in labor, in belonging, humanity would have remained scattered. Clever hunters, skilled gatherers, but never builders of nations. From hearth to horizon. And so, the legacy of the first villages stretches from hearth to horizon, from the small flames of fires lit each dawn to the great flames of cities that would later blaze across history. From the quiet footsteps on dirt paths to the crowded streets of future empires. From the first clay pot filled with grain to the great storehouses of kings. The seed planted in those walls of mud and stone grew into the vast forests of human culture, memory, and ambition. Closing reflection. Tonight, as you imagine those first villages, picture them not as ruins or relics, but as living organisms, their breath carried on through us. Every home we live in, every street we walk, every community we belong to, all of these are echoes of those first hearths. The people of those villages are long gone. Their walls have crumbled, their fields have turned to dust, but their legacy lives on, carried not only in the soil, but in us, because we too still live in villages, only larger, taller, louder. The shape may have changed, but the heartbeat remains the same. From hearth to horizon, the story of humanity is the story of the village. Story 4. The First Kings. Power woven from myth and memory. Section 1. When leaders became more than men. The human story is full of turning points. Moments when a quiet change in how people lived reshaped the future of civilization. One of the most mysterious and enduring of these moments came when ordinary leaders, elders, warriors, chiefs, became something more. When their authority no longer ended with their breath. When their words carried the weight of law, their memory outlasted their bones, and their names echoed as kings. The seeds of authority. In the earliest villages, there were no kings. There were elders, wise with years, hunters who knew the paths of animals, women who remembered the secrets of healing roots and herbs, shamans who told the stories of spirits. Leadership was shared, shifting like the seasons. The one who led the hunt was not the one who blessed the harvest. Decisions were made around the fire, not carved into stone. But as villages grew into towns, and towns into early cities, leadership could no longer remain so fluid. Fields needed irrigation. Walls needed repair. Grain had to be stored and guarded. Disputes needed settling. Trade had to be managed. Slowly, figures of greater authority emerged. At first, they were coordinators, organizers, mediators. But soon, they became something greater. Rulers. The first mantle of kingship. What set a king apart from an ordinary leader? It was not only power. Power can be taken by force, but kingship was something deeper. The first kings clothed themselves not only in authority, but in myth. They claimed descent from gods or favor from spirits. Their power was not merely human, but divine. They became the bridge between heaven and earth. This was the great innovation, the blending of leadership with sacred meaning. By weaving themselves into myth, rulers became more than men. They became symbols, embodiments of their people's hopes and fears. A chieftain could be killed, but the king was eternal, because the crown passed on, the throne endured, the myth never died. Gilgamesh and the Echo of Legends. To glimpse how ancient people thought of kingship, we can turn to the world's first great story, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh was said to be 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, a king of Uruk who wrestled with gods and sought immortality. Whether he was a real man or a myth woven from memory hardly matters. What matters is how he was remembered, as more than mortal. The tale of Gilgamesh shows us that kingship was never just about rule. It was about embodying the struggles of humanity itself, mortality and memory, order and chaos, life and death. Kings became the stage upon which entire civilizations told their stories. The city and the throne. The rise of kings was tied closely to the rise of cities. A small village could manage itself with elders and councils, but a city, with thousands of people, needed something different. Walls had to be defended, canals dug and maintained, armies fed and commanded, festivals organized, laws proclaimed, and so the throne rose alongside the temple. The palace and the shrine often stood side by side, earthly power and sacred power, woven together. To disobey the king was not only to reject order, but to risk angering the gods. To follow the king was to join a story larger than oneself. The king as shepherd. Interestingly, the earliest language we have for kingship is not of conquest, but of care. In Mesopotamia, kings were called shepherds of their people. They were meant to guide, protect, and nurture, much as a shepherd does his flock. The metaphor reveals how deeply kingship was tied to survival. Without strong leadership, canals might fail, floods might drown fields, enemies might invade. The king's role was to ensure that life continued, that abundance was possible, that safety was secured. Of course, not all kings lived up to this image. Some were cruel, some greedy. Yet the idea endured, the king as guardian, protector, shepherd. The burden of immortality. For ordinary people, death was the end. But kings lived on. Their names were carved into stone, sung in hymns, remembered in ritual. This was both blessing and burden. Blessing because kings achieved a form of immortality. Their deeds were not forgotten when their bodies returned to dust. Burden because kingship demanded greatness. A failed king left scars that lingered for generations. The crown was heavy not only because it symbolized power, but because it demanded memory. A king could not fade quietly into obscurity. His reign, for good or ill, would be remembered. The ritual of rule. The first kingship was not a crown and a throne as we imagine today. It was ritual. When a new ruler was chosen, ceremonies bound him to both people and gods. He might be anointed with oil, clothed in sacred garments, or presented with emblems of authority, a staff, a ring, a scepter. These rituals mattered deeply. They marked the king not as an ordinary man elevated for a time, but as one transformed. He was reborn as a figure of cosmic importance, woven into the order of the universe. Without ritual, power was fragile. With ritual, it became eternal. Kings and memory kingship was as much about the past as it was about the present. The first kings often claimed lineage from great ancestors or mythical heroes. They carried memory forward, presenting themselves as the living embodiment of history. Each reign was a chapter in a story that stretched beyond lifetimes. People could look to their ruler and feel connected not only to their neighbors, but to generations past and generations yet to come. Kingship became a vessel of memory, a way to bind time itself into the fabric of society. Fear and reverence. Why did people accept kings? Was it love or fear? The truth is both. Kings inspired awe. Their palaces rose above the city, their rituals dazzled with splendor, their armies marched with thunderous might. But beneath the fear was also need. People wanted order in a world that often seemed chaotic. Floods, droughts, raids, disease, life was fragile. Kings promised stability, protection, meaning. To follow the king was to believe that life could be more than survival, that it could have structure, rhythm, and purpose. The first thrones. Imagine an early throne, not a golden chair, but a simple seat of wood or stone, placed upon a raised platform. Around it, people gathered, waiting for judgment, blessing, or command. That throne was more than a seat. It was a symbol. Whoever sat upon it carried not only his own weight, but the weight of an entire community. Over time, thrones grew taller, palaces more ornate, crowns more glittering. But the essence remained the same. The throne was the place where one man became more than himself, became the vessel of a people's power and dreams. The mystery of obedience. There is something strange about kingship, something that puzzled thinkers for millennia. Why would thousands obey the will of one? Why would free people bow to a single figure? The answer lies in myth and memory. Kings were not just individuals. They were symbols. They represented order against chaos, life against death, abundance against famine. By obeying the king, people felt they were participating in something larger than themselves, a cosmic order that gave meaning to their lives. Obedience was not only submission, it was belief. A world of first kings. Though Mesopotamia gave us the earliest written accounts, kingship appeared in many places. In Egypt, pharaohs were seen as living gods, embodiments of Horus on earth. In the Indus Valley, rulers may have coordinated vast cities with baths and granaries. In ancient China, kings ruled under the mandate of heaven, their authority tied to cosmic harmony. Every culture told the story differently, but the essence was the same. Rulers were not ordinary men. They were bridges between the human and the divine, between chaos and order. Closing reflection. As you drift tonight, imagine one of those first kings seated upon a simple throne. The people gather around, their voices hushed, their hearts filled with awe. They do not see just a man. They see a story, a memory, a hope made flesh. The invention of kingship was not the invention of power. Power had always existed. It was the invention of permanence, of myth, of rule that endured beyond one lifetime. And in that moment, humanity stepped into a new world. A world where leaders became more than men, and where history itself began to be shaped by crowns and thrones. Section 2. The King's Two Bodies, Flesh and Myth. When we think of a king, we see both a man and something more than a man. We see flesh and blood, but also a figure who seems to stand outside ordinary life, who carries a weight larger than himself. This paradox, the king as both mortal body and immortal symbol, was at the heart of ancient kingship. It was what made the throne endure even as kings died, what gave rulers an aura that outlasted their fragile human frame. Two lives in one. The idea of the king's two bodies has echoed across history. On one side, there is the natural body, the same as any other man's. He hungers, bleeds, sickens, ages, and eventually dies. His feet grow sore, his skin wrinkles, his voice weakens. But on the other side, there is the symbolic body, the crown, the office, the story woven around him. That body does not age. That body survives death. That body is eternal, carried on by the next ruler and the one after him, like an unbroken flame passed from torch to torch. This duality gave kingship its strange magic. It allowed rulers to be mortal and immortal at once, both fragile men and enduring myths. The king who dies, the kingship that lives. Every ruler knew he would one day die, but kingship itself could not die. When a king fell, his successor rose. Rituals of mourning often included great processions, laments, and offerings, not only to honor the man, but to signal that the kingship itself had not ended. The crown, the throne, the symbols of office passed on untouched. One man was gone, but the story lived. The body of flesh was replaced, the body of myth endured. This continuity was vital. Without it, society might collapse into chaos. The people did not just need a ruler, they needed to believe that rule itself was unbroken. Rituals of renewal. To keep the symbolic body alive, rituals were woven around the king's life. In Mesopotamia, during the New Year festival in Babylon, the king was stripped of his crown and scepter, humbled before the gods, and then recrowned. The ritual was a reminder. His natural body was nothing, but the kingship itself was eternal. In Egypt, pharaohs underwent repeated ceremonies of renewal, reaffirming their divine essence. Even as their mortal bodies aged, the rituals declared that the divine kingship within them remained youthful and strong. These ceremonies were more than pageantry. They reassured the people that their world was secure, that order had not faded, that the myth of kingship still blazed brightly. The fragility of flesh. Yet, the mortal body could never be ignored. A sick king could shake the faith of a kingdom. A weak king, limping or coughing, could make people doubt the divine power he claimed to carry. Ancient chronicles often record anxieties around the health of rulers. If the king was ill, was it a sign that the gods were displeased? If he died suddenly, was it punishment or omen? To protect against such doubts, many cultures surrounded kings with elaborate guards, physicians, priests. Their diets were carefully controlled, their appearances staged. Even their words were often shaped by scribes to ensure that what came from the throne carried dignity and strength. The flesh was fragile, but the myth required the image of invulnerability. The mask of immortality. The tension between body and myth gave rise to a kind of mask. The king had to hide weakness, disguise pain, suppress ordinary human frailty. A ruler might be grieving, yet he had to appear strong. He might be weary, yet he had to speak with authority. He might be doubtful, yet he had to proclaim certainty. This mask was not simply deception. It was necessity. To maintain the symbolic body, the king had to transcend his own natural body in the eyes of his people. The crown itself was a part of this mask. Once placed upon his head, it marked the man as something more. People no longer looked at the individual, but at the office, the myth, the story that clothed him like a second skin. The tomb and the memory death was the ultimate test of the king's two bodies. The natural body decayed, but the symbolic body had to be preserved. This is why the tombs of kings became so important. They were not only resting places for flesh, they were monuments to myth. The pyramids of Egypt were colossal attempts to immortalize the pharaoh's symbolic body, to anchor his divine essence forever in stone. The ziggurats and royal graves of Mesopotamia served a similar role. They proclaimed that the king had not truly died, that he still lived in some way, guarding and guiding his people. Through tombs, monuments, and memory, the symbolic body triumphed over the natural one. The king as ritual actor. Kings often enacted rituals that made their symbolic body visible. They plowed the first furrow of the fields in spring, symbolizing fertility for all. They presided over sacrifices, standing as intermediaries between gods and humans. They judged disputes, embodying justice itself. Each action was more than practical. It was performance. The king was not just a man doing a task. He was the mythic body of kingship enacting the eternal order of the cosmos. Through these repeated actions, people saw not the frail man, but the enduring figure of rule itself. The king's body as the body of the land. In many traditions, the king's body was thought to be mystically tied to the health of the land. If he was strong, the fields flourished, the rivers flowed, the herds multiplied. If he was weak, the land suffered. This belief is found in myths worldwide, from the Egyptian pharaohs who were seen as guarantors of the Nile's floods, to Celtic legends where the king's vitality was bound to the fertility of the soil. The king's two bodies were not only metaphorical, but cosmic. His fleshly health mirrored the health of the earth. His symbolic body carried the fate of the world itself. The burden of representation. Living with two bodies was a burden. The man inside the crown might long for rest, yet he had to carry the weight of ritual, expectation, and symbolism. His every word was judged, his every action magnified. He could never be simply himself. He was always also the king. This separation between personal life and public role is something leaders throughout history have carried, but for the first kings it was especially heavy. They were inventing the very idea of rulership as a sacred calling. Every mistake threatened not only their reputation, but the myth itself. The king who was no king. Sometimes the balance collapsed. When a ruler lost the ability to embody the symbolic body, through defeat, illness, or disgrace, his authority crumbled. Ancient chronicles tell of rulers who were overthrown, not only because they failed in battle or mismanaged crops, but because they failed in myth. They no longer seemed to embody the divine. In such moments, the fragile body destroyed the immortal one. The two bodies fell apart, and when that happened, kingship itself had to be renewed through rebellion, ritual, or new lineage. The eternal crown. Yet, despite failures, the idea of the king's two bodies endured. Even today, we still sense this strange duality in leaders. We know they are mortal, flawed humans, yet we invest them with symbolic weight. Their actions feel larger than life. Their offices seem timeless. Their deaths shake nations. The first kings discovered something enduring. People crave symbols, continuity, myth. And so long as that need exists, the idea of the king's two bodies, flesh and myth, will remain. Section 3. The Weight of the Crown, Kingship's Legacy. Through the Ages. The first kings lived in mud-brick cities, in palaces half swallowed by desert winds, their names etched on clay tablets or carved into stone. Yet the idea they carried, kingship, traveled far beyond them. What began as fragile experiments in authority became one of humanity's most enduring inventions. The crown, the throne, the myth of rule. All of these would echo through millennia, shaping empires, dynasties, and nations. This final part of our journey lingers on that legacy. On how the king's role outlived the first rulers, how its weight was carried differently in different ages, and how its shadow still falls across the world even today. The crown as symbol. A crown is, in one sense, a simple object. Metal shaped into a circle, sometimes adorned with jewels, sometimes just a band of gold or bronze, but its meaning is immense. The crown does not feed anyone. It cannot hold back flood or famine. It cannot win a battle on its own. And yet, placed upon a head, it transforms a person into something larger than themselves. This transformation became one of the most powerful symbols in human history. The crown was no longer just decoration. It was the visible sign of that second body of kingship, the body of myth, the eternal office. From Mesopotamian diadems to Egyptian headdresses, from European crowns to Asian coronets, the idea remained the same. A circle of authority, linking the ruler not only to his people, but also to the divine. Thrones and courts. Just as the crown became the visible mark of kingship, the throne became its stage. The throne room was never merely furniture in a hall. It was the sacred center of power. To approach the throne was to approach kingship itself. Petitioners bowed, ambassadors brought gifts, generals bent their knees, not simply to a man, but to the weight of rule made visible in wood, ivory, or gold. Around the throne, courts formed. Nobles, priests, guards, scribes. The king was never alone. He was surrounded by a living machinery of ritual and service. The court magnified his presence, echoing his authority outward. Even silence in a throne room could be a performance, a reminder of power. The legacy of these thrones and courts still lingers. Modern halls of state, with their solemn ceremonies, inherit something from those ancient palaces where the first kings sat in judgment. Empire and expansion. The earliest kings ruled single cities or clusters of villages. But once the pattern was set, kingship became a seed that grew into vast empires. In Mesopotamia, Sargon of Akkad claimed to rule the 4 quarters of the world. In Egypt, pharaohs extended their borders into Nubia and the Levant. In China, the mandate of heaven was invoked to justify uniting wide stretches of land under a single ruler. Kingship scaled. The same principles that bound a village to its king could be stretched to bind whole nations. Ritual, myth, the king's 2 bodies. These provided the glue that held empires together, even when geography, language, and culture pulled them apart. Of course, expansion brought strain. To rule far-flung lands required armies, messengers, and bureaucracy. The king himself became increasingly distant from ordinary people. But myth filled the gap. Even if a peasant never saw the king with his own eyes, he could still picture him as a cosmic figure, upholding order across the world. Kingship and religion. The relationship between kingship and religion remained close through the ages. In some places, the king was divine himself, the son of the gods or even a god in human form. In others, he was the chosen one, the anointed, standing as intermediary between heaven and earth. Coronations often included sacred rites, anointing with oil, blessing by priests, sacrifices at temples. These acts declared that kingship was not mere politics but sacred order. Religion gave kingship cosmic depth, and kingship, in return, gave religion earthly form, with temples, festivals, and monuments sponsored by rulers eager to show their devotion. Together, the two reinforced one another, weaving a net of meaning around the throne, the fragility of thrones. But kingship was never invulnerable. Thrones toppled, dynasties fell, palaces burned. Sometimes kingship itself was rejected, as in times of rebellion when people declared themselves free of kings. Yet even when rejected, the idea returned. In Athens, citizens prided themselves on democracy, but they still used ritual language that echoed kingship. In Rome, kings were overthrown, but emperors rose in their place. Emperors who wore crowns of laurel, sat on thrones, and ruled with mythic aura. It seems that even when humanity tried to cast off kingship, the weight of the crown found a way back, reshaped, reimagined, but still recognizable. The crown's weight on the individual. For those who wore it, the crown was not only a gift, but a burden. To be king was to be endlessly watched, endlessly judged, endlessly responsible. Every victory was magnified, but so was every failure. A bad harvest, a defeat in war, even a comet in the sky, all could be blamed on the king. Many kings carried this burden with pride, convinced they were chosen by destiny. Others were crushed by it, longing for freedom they could never have. Stories abound of rulers who disguised themselves to walk among their people, seeking a brief taste of ordinary life. But even in disguise, they could not escape the crown. The symbolic body was always there, a shadow they could not set aside. Kingship and memory. Perhaps the most enduring part of kingship's legacy is memory. Kings built monuments not only for themselves, but for the myth of rule. They filled the landscape with palaces, stelae, tombs, and inscriptions, ensuring that even when their bodies turned to dust, the story of kingship remained carved in stone. In this way, kingship became a kind of memory machine. Each ruler inherited the weight of past kings and passed it on to the future. The crown was heavier not just with gold, but with centuries of expectation, tradition, and legend. When we walk among ruins today, the broken walls of Nineveh, the shattered statues of pharaohs, the silent palaces of Mayan kings, we still feel that weight. The stones whisper not only of men who lived, but of the eternal idea they carried. The echo in the modern world. And so we come to today. We may not live under the first kings anymore, but echoes of their invention surround us. Ceremonies of state, parades, the symbolism of crowns, even the language of leadership, all carry traces of those first palaces. The myth of the ruler as more than a person, as a figure who embodies something greater, has not vanished. Even in republics, presidents or prime ministers are often invested with symbolic weight. Their offices outlast them. Their words are treated with ritual solemnity. Their faces appear on coins, much like ancient kings. We may believe we left kingship behind, but in truth, the idea remains with us. It is hard to imagine a world without some version of the crown.